I made a previous video looking at the difference between quantitative and qualitative data, and I suggested that the boundaries were not as clear cut as people sometimes suggest. That even if you're looking at data that's definitely quantitative, you also need to be thinking about the quality of that data. Now, I made that video as a kind of preliminary comments for what I'm going to do today, because a friend asked me to look at Q methodology. Now, I knew nothing about Q methodology. It's a technique that was developed in the 1930s by a psychologist called Stevenson, and I'd never heard of it until the person who raised the question said they'd come across it and they wanted to know more. So I had a little look into it, and it claims to be a method that combines quantitative and qualitative, and that immediately makes me a bit suspicious. But around that time, shortly before, shortly after the Second World War, a lot of people were using mathematical models and skills they developed in scientific approaches and engineering to solving social problems of strategy, and so it seems not unreasonable that somebody who, as Stevenson was, brought up in the traditions of psychometrics and the measurement of psychological traits would think of applying a quantitative method to people's opinions. And what it suggests is that you want to look for a topic that you want to research, and you first of all start off by looking at the things that people have said about that field. So let's suppose we've got a topic in mind that we're going to look at an introductory year for bachelor studies where students are obliged to take a wide range of different subjects rather than going straight into their specialisation, a general introduction to HE. And the first thing to do is to look for the range of things that people might say about this topic. I mean, I might say, I'd hate it. I wanted to specialise. By the time I got to higher education, I wanted to specialise. But that's not the only opinion that I could hold. So the first thing it does is it encourages me to go out and look at the range of opinions that have been expressed. I could look at innovations, for example, in the 1960s. Kiel University introduced such a scheme that every undergraduate student had to do a general first year as a starting point, as a basis, as a foundation for their higher education. So who advocated that? What was said about it? And I collect, as a researcher, I collect a range of all of the things that people might say about it's important for citizens to have a broad range of knowledge. It's important for people to locate their specialist knowledge within a broader context. All of those things might be said about this, and you could look for policy documents, you could look for newspaper reports, you could simply sit down in an armchair and think about the things that could be said. And that whole universe of discourse is what the Q method then approaches. And it selects from that range of possible opinions, typical opinions, opinions that typify the range of, again, trying to be inclusive, trying to include the whole range of possible opinions, so that you're now going to go out and you're going to put those statements onto card in order to actually look at the opinions that people hold. I've got cards with opinions written on them, and we're going to go out and we're going to ask people, do you agree with these or do you disagree with them? Do you strongly disagree with them, or do you strongly disagree with them, or do you strongly agree with them, or do you feel neutral about them? And what we're going to ask them to do is to place those opinions into a grid. So I've sorted those opinions into things that they strongly agree with and things that they strongly disagree with, and we're going to ask them to put them in the grid with the things they most strongly agree with at one end and the things they most strongly disagree with at the other end. So first of all, from the range of things you sorted out, what's the one you most strongly agree with? You put it in the grid. What's the one you most strongly disagree with? Put it in the other end of the grid. And so on, building up from the outside, asking them the things that they most strongly feel about, and then until they come to the neutral ones in the middle where they don't feel very strongly, and they have ranked from most agree to most disagree the various opinions that you've put to them. And now you go into quantitative mode. You use some sort of technique like a rank order coefficient in order to group the people together. Use factor analysis to group people together so that those people whose patterns are most similar on opinions are grouped together, and you're going to construct some sort of composite opinion. I'm not sure what a composite opinion is exactly, but you're some sort of typical social position, 2 or 3 or 4 social positions about the topic. You might have those people who are specialist teachers of scientific or social science subjects who don't want their students to be wasting a year on general studies. They want them to specialise immediately and get great depth of understanding. You might have politicians who advocate for the importance of higher education for citizenship. You'll see different groupings, and different groupings will have agreed and disagreed with different opinions. And this is the point that Q methodology is trying to do, is trying to typify those standard positions. Now, that's, as I understand it, and I haven't spent a lot of time on this, but that, as I understand it, is Q methodology. It's a simple but routine and disciplined approach to eliciting people's opinions and then constructing group opinions so that you can typify the responses that people make to a particular topic. Now, is it good? Well, it doesn't stop you having to think. It doesn't absolve you of the need to think. You've got you're coming out with numbers at the end. Think about the quality of those numbers. How much does the result that you're getting depend upon the statements that you selected in the first place? If you had another a very wildly different opinion, would it affect the outcome? If you had two very similar opinions in that selection, how would that skew the results? Because you'd have more weight attached to that particular pair of opinions if they were very, very similar. So there's kind of questions about the sensitivity of the numbers to the decisions that you're making in the first place. So having a methodology like Q methodology doesn't absolve you from the need to think about the quality of what you're doing and whether the numbers actually represent what you're trying to. The second thing is, I've already mentioned, I'm not quite sure what a collective opinion is, but I suppose a political party represents a kind of coalition around a group of opinions. I think that you might say there are factions in society that will take particular views. So let's be careful about how we interpret. And finally, there's a question of interpretation, that when I've characterised certain different positions to you, a politician might say education is citizenship. That doesn't come out of the numbers. A factor analysis, you still have to interpret what the factor means, unless you've designed the questions with particular factors in mind, in which case you'd not be using this methodology. So I don't think that this resolves all the problems any more than simply saying a combination of quantitative and qualitative methods is the answer. Is it better than just rocking up to your interviews and asking the first questions that come to the front of your mind? Is it a systematic way of trying to be more careful and thoughtful over the selection of questions that you're putting to people? You're putting very specific questions to your respondents. You say, do you disagree with this or agree with it? How strongly do you agree with this compared with how strongly you agree with that? So it's a disciplined way, and yes, it makes you think about the questions you're asking, and it ensures that the respondents are thinking carefully about it, because they're not just giving the answer that they think you want. Well, they may still do that, but they're not just giving the first thought that comes to the forefront of their minds. So it doesn't resolve all the difficulties. I like methods that go beyond the interview, that go to, or simple questionnaire, go to trying to stimulate the respondent to think carefully about what the question is that you're asking. There are several ways of doing that. This is one. I would suggest you might want to have a look at Kelly's repertory grids, which is a very similar technique that was developed later. I mean, I don't know whether Kelly knew the work of Stevenson, but it's a way of organising the questions. Apart from anything else, when you come to draw your conclusions, you do know exactly what question you asked your respondents, and so you'll have a head start in interpreting what they meant when they answered a particular question. So I quite like ways of eliciting opinions where you describe a concrete scenario rather than simply asking, do you use social media? You ask, how many hours did you spend on social media last week? Or you, in a particular situation, you hear a piece of news, do you feel a need to go into social media to get confirmation? I prefer concrete questions, very specific questions, to kind of general, off the top of my head questions about what you think. So is this a useful method? Clearly, it's a way of focusing attention, being systematic, making sure that you as a researcher and your respondents as respondents are thinking about the same questions. And I'm all in favour of that. Does it absolve you of the need to think carefully about quantitative data, what its quality is, and how resilient is it to changes like introducing another opinion? Those kinds of questions about the reliability of the method still remain. And so these methods that help you to focus are all well and good. They don't take away from you the need to be thinking about what's the quality of the data. By the way, if you say, and I hope you won't be saying, I'm using a mixed methods because I'm using a combination of quantitative and qualitative, remember that's what this Q methodology was sold on. So if you say that you're using quantitative and qualitative, what kind of quantitative and qualitative, what kind of mixed methods? Q methodology is a mixed method approach. Is it the mixed method approach that you're using? There's no strict formulae that get you out of the question, asking the difficult questions about how good is the data? What does the data mean? How can I interpret it? What questions were actually asked? And am I doing the questions justice when I interpret them in a particular way? In fact, there's no shortcut for thinking. So yes, Q methodology, by all means, have a look at it, have a look at other methods, think about what methods you're going to use. None of them are going to save you the headache of thinking about what you're doing with your research.